Hi everyone, welcome to Queer Stories. After I did my last video on gender, there were a few people that reached out saying they wanted to have more resources because they wanted to know more. So I have literally spent the past week scouring through YouTube trying to find some good videos about gender. And I was pretty disappointed when I saw how little there was that I thought was good and how much there was that was so bad, at least from my perspective. And so rather than continuing to go on this quest to try and find a good documentary on YouTube, I thought, why don't I just take one of the bad ones and tell you guys why I think it's bad. So this is my first time doing a reaction video. I'm not going to play through the entire video because it's a bit long, but I'll put the link to the video in the description. So if you want to go and watch the whole video, torture yourself with the whole video, you're welcome to. But I'm just going to pick out some key points from the video to discuss.
They tell you that a man can actually identify as a woman, and your instinct, cognitive biology, and common sense reject this idea because your gender is decided at birth. And then they say, no, 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 you're thinking of sex. You know, that word that used to be synonymous with gender until we decided that they were different. Yeah, that word. Sex is biological, gender is chosen. Except that isn't true.
So before we keep going here, I just want to point out one thing, which is that he's using the term we, but who is the we that he's talking about? I think it's really important to remember that given that gender is a social construct, so how we actually behave in society is a social construct, then the we is very dependent on where you live, what time period you're born, the culture that you're raised in. He's presenting this idea that we have never had an idea of gender that's separate from sex. And he's wrong if he's talking about everybody on the planet, because there are many cultures that have had concepts of people that live between the two. If he's talking about a middle-class American we, even in that case, I'm sure that I can dig up some examples that go back a long time of people that decided to live between the genders. We just didn't really talk about it that much. So let's just be aware of the we when we're talking, that it's very important to sort of centralize our social context.
So gender is separate from sex. This idea is being promoted all over the media and culture. This idea is definitely being promoted in universities, I can tell you that for sure. And now even people actually as young as preschool and kindergarten are being indoctrinated with this idea. So take a look.
The issue stems from a lesson on what it means to be transgender. After a kindergarten student at Rockland Academy Gateway, born a boy, was reintroduced to her class as a transgender girl back in June. Her teacher read the class 2 books about being transgender. The lesson was done without parents or administrators being notified.
I forgot who said it, but they were talking about what the left does when they try to sound intelligent. Like, they take a concept that is totally absurd, like gender being different from sex, and then they think that just because they can explain it to you with their rhetoric from their neo-Marxist pseudoscience that it's intelligent. And they compared it to when a baby spills SpaghettiOs all over its high chair and then thinks that just because it made it look like a dinosaur that it's done something intelligent. And then the parents just standing there like looking at this mess like, what the hell? But
okay, so I just want to point out that this guy obviously thinks he's very smart. And I think he's deliberately talking really fast because he wants you to know how smart he is. And sometimes people take this approach where they just bombard you with information and then you're sort of like sitting back there going like, oh my God, he must know what he's talking about because he has so many things to say about this. But just because he's speaking quickly does not mean that he knows what he's talking about. I also want to just say the example that he's giving is that somebody in kindergarten has decided to present as a different gender. And it's up to the parents of a child whether or not they want to enable their child to explore different genders when they're at a younger age. But it's important to realize that that kind of exploration as a child is not the same thing as deciding to take a permanent identity as a different gender or as non-binary as an adult. Many children will go through phases where they explore different things in between the genders, and some of them grow out of it, and some of them find out that they're transgender, and some choose to identify as non-binary as they get older. So it's not like there's a cookie cutter mold. But when parents give their children the flexibility to explore themselves, what they're doing is they're creating a safe environment for their child. And they are not trying to bully their child into expressing themselves in a way that they're not comfortable with. I don't know that it makes sense to use the word transgender when it comes to a child because of the fact that they might decide later on that they want to change.
So here's the most damning observation for this idea. If you are born a male and you identify as a female, you will act in ways that females act in order to express this. You will take interest in things that females take interest in. In other words, you will start to artificially assume the role of a female using the ways that females naturally behave because of their cognitive biology as your template. There would be no way for you to act like a woman if there was no tendency of biological women to act in a certain way. Your identity as a woman, despite being a man, is predicated on the fact that biological women have their own way of behaving.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that women have certain traits that they do tend to behave in certain ways, and men have traits that are different. And this probably has some truth to it, right? That when we look at personality types, for example, if you look at the Myers-Briggs test and you look at personality distributions over large population densities, there are certain personalities that women trend towards more often and certain personalities that men trend towards more often. And I'm sure with those personalities that there are certain behaviors that will manifest because of that. People that believe that gender is separate from sex are not trying to say that there is an equal distribution between the middle. There's obviously going to be certain people that will, when they're identifying as female, that will choose to exhibit certain traits. What we're saying is that people who are born female but who exhibit traits that are not stereotypically considered female within a cultural context should not be berated for that. And judgments should not be made upon those people. So if I'm female and I decide that I'm really into sports, I have more leadership tendencies, you shouldn't be questioning my femininity because of the fact that I have traits that go outside of that. I am the only one that can determine for myself whether I identify as female or whether I identify as something else.
The Frankfurt School, for those of you who are not familiar, is a social research institute occupied by Marxist intellectuals. Anyways, with gender theory in particular, they have this really convenient explanation, which is basically that the only reason that men and women are different is because they were taught to be different. They don't believe that there is a male or a female brain. They don't like evolutionary psychology or biology at all, and they really don't like that virtually all empirical data contradicts this idea.
Okay, so he's talking about something called the Frankfurt School, which is a particular group of thinkers that happen to believe that we are taught our gender roles. I don't know anything about the Frankfurt School, and I'm not going to comment on what they believe or don't believe or what kind of literature they may have produced or they may not have produced, but I will speak to you as somebody that has been in this community for a long time. Start to exhibit traits outside the normal gender, people will point that out and they'll try to herd you back in again. So as an example, a friend of mine just recently cut her hair boy short, so very, very short. And immediately everybody in her social circle, her coworkers, friends, and family all reached out to her and said, why did you cut your hair? Your hair was so beautiful before. She had long, beautiful hair, and then she cut it short. And it's like everybody else felt like they had the right to tell her whether or not her new look was appropriate for her. And I'm sure a lot of that ties into the fact that it does look more like a boy's haircut. These sorts of things are just examples of way that people try to subtly say your gender expression is not socially acceptable.
But nonetheless, this idea stemmed from a hypothesis that a woman named Simone de Beauvoir wrote about in her book titled The Second Sex in 1949. She wrote that one is not born but becomes a woman. This wasn't tested at the time, it was just a hypothesis, just a theory, but it's the foundation for all modern gender theory, this idea that you are just raised as a male or a female. So then, in the 1950s and 60s, this guy named John Money developed and tested a hypothesis that was based off this idea from Simone de Beauvoir, and his hypothesis was that sex is biological and gender is socially constructed. This is the twin study. You hear a lot about this. This is the foundation for all of it. This study, and when it was published, it was celebrated as groundbreaking and brilliant, a huge success, etc., etc. So what was the study? Basically, this boy named David Reimer had a botched circumcision that left him without a penis. So they removed his testicles and raised him as a girl. he had a twin brother. His name was Brian, and the idea was that they would raise David as a girl and Brian as a boy, and then they would see, what happens. So, two twin boys. Some of these exercises that they did to reinforce the gender roles had these two twin boys assuming sex positions with each other while John Money took pictures. David, now referred to as Brenda, would have to be in the submissive position, while his brother would be in the dominant position. This is how they did it. Gender psychology for you folks.
Obviously, I'm not going to think that this study was in any way scientific or means anything. The whole basis of experiments in science is that experiments need to be repeatable, and you need to achieve the same results every time when you do an experiment in order to be able to draw conclusions from that experiment. So this is not a scientific experiment. This has nothing to do with modern gender theory as far as I'm concerned. To me, this is a really unfortunate situation for this poor child, because I actually think he was mutilated as a child. Nowadays, I think circumcision is being viewed more and more as something that's a little bit like outside of the choice of the child, and so it's a little bit questionable whether or not it's morally acceptable. But obviously, given the religious undertones of it, I don't want to get too much into whether or not I approve of that. I think the more important thing to consider, though, is that when you do look at twins out in the wide world, you will see many examples of twins that are identical twins and have different gender identities. And you will see examples of twins that are identical twins that do have the same identities. So I'm thinking of two different examples. I'm thinking of one example of twins that came out on YouTube, and in their coming out video, they said they're both gay. So they both identified as cisgender male, and they both fall in love with other men. The other example I'm thinking of is Laverne Cox. So Laverne Cox is actually an identical twin, and her twin brother is a cisgender male, and she is a transgender woman. Twins are not necessarily always going to express the same kind of gender to begin with, much less if you do some kind of social conditioning upon them to try and manifest some kind of gender. So this experiment is garbage, and I'm going to ignore anything that he says about this experiment for the rest of this video.
This, by the way, is the reason that we now separate sex from gender. This study. This is the reason why.
There is just one thing I want to address with what he said here, which is that he said that this study is the entire basis for modern gender theory, and I completely reject that. The basis for modern gender theory is thousands upon thousands of people that are coming forward with their own personal experiences and are starting to talk about it. Until recently, the social stigma was so large for anyone that fit outside the normal gender binary that most people who didn't feel like they fit in, they just shut up, and they wouldn't identify themselves as anything outside on a survey or much less in a conversation. But now it's something that people are starting to talk about a lot more. And so we're seeing people that are coming out with YouTube channels like mine. We're starting to see some surveys that are coming out that actually have questions about gender and sexuality on them. And so we're able to gather more data. When we talk about modern gender theory, we're really using larger statistical outcomes to derive our theory. It has nothing to do with a particular study that was done a bajillion years ago.
The study is then the foundation of, this idea of gender fluidity and multiple and infinite genders, which emerged in the 1980s and 1990s from people like Judith Butler, who of course cites Money in the twin study as the basis of her hypothesis. Even Money would have thought multiple genders is absurd, and he literally took pictures of softcore child pornography in the name of science. So there's his credibility. This is not science. It's not credible. It's not true. Gender is not separate from sex, and anyone that tries to convince you that it is, ask them if they know that the only proof they have of this hypothesis is that a guy tried to raise twins as boys and girls like 50 years ago, and then both of them later ended up living troubled lives and dying prematurely.
One thing that he does say that I agree with is that this study is not science. But then he goes on to say that because this study is the only proof that we have, that we cannot determine that gender is separate from sex. But what he's doing when he does that is he is ignoring the lived experiences of everybody that has come forward to say that they don't identify with their birth sex.
Here's an anecdote from my life that supports this in addition to the facts that I just gave. I grew up with sisters, and I had two sisters, and so we had more girl toys than boy toys. So when I'd play with my sister, we'd usually play with Barbies or something like that. But she didn't like playing with me because I would always make the Barbies fight or kill each other and rip each other's legs and heads off. And I know that you think I was a child sociopath, but that was just my male drive to dominate and fight and conquer, just shining through. It didn't matter what I was playing with. Like, sure, it was easier to make my army guys fight, but I won't hesitate to run a Barbie over with a pink convertible either. So parents that try to raise their kids with gender-neutral toys often find that the child is going to inevitably do what the child wants to do with them.
What he's saying here is not wrong, but he is approaching it from the wrong angle. So he's looking at his own experience as a cisgender male and saying that when he played with Barbies as a young man, he exhibited typical male traits in terms of the way that he made them play with each other. What if he was different? What if he was a male, but instead of actually exhibiting male behaviors, he exhibited more typical female behaviors instead? What if he made those Barbie dolls fall in love? What if he told stories about what their life would be like together? What if he imagined those dolls getting married and having kids and basically playing with them like a girl? What if instead of playing with Barbie dolls, he enjoyed wearing dresses and putting makeup on, but he was a boy? These are the sorts of behaviors that we're talking about. If you are cisgender and you are exhibiting behaviors that already fit within the normal gender binary, there's no problem with that. What we're saying is that people who naturally start to exhibit behaviors that are not associated with their typical gender should not be told that there's something wrong with them. They are just a kid and they're just exploring, and we should just let them be kids and play the way that they want to play.
For their theory of sex and gender being different, it must be true that there's nothing that makes a man except for his reproductive organs, and nothing that makes a woman except for her reproductive organs as well.
That's not true. There are definitely statistical traits that are similar amongst males and statistical traits that are similar among females.
They reject the idea that there's a male and female brain, and they dismiss any empirical differences in male and female brains as a result of being conditioned or taught to behave in certain ways or take interest in certain things. Obviously, there are exceptions to these tendencies, but citing an anecdote about a friend that you have that's better than boys at solving complex mathematical equations doesn't invalidate the observed tendencies between the two genders. 2. There are two genders. So let's look at a few of these. First, I want to talk about IQ because I think it's very important, and then I'll talk more about IQ in another video. But with IQ differences between men and women, women tend to have average IQs with a steeper normal distribution, meaning that they are more likely to have average intelligence or not deviate from that to either extreme very much. The average male IQ is roughly the same as the average female IQ. However, we also concentrate in both extremes of the distribution, meaning that we have many more high IQ men than high IQ women. But to the contrary, we also have more low IQ men than we do low IQ women. This explains why men dominate STEM fields and women dominate lower IQ majors like early education or social work. And to this you might say, well, if men also have clustered presence of low IQ individuals, where are they in those majors? Well, if you look at the graph, you'll notice that while the IQs are low in comparison, they are still at or slightly above average. This explains why while they are female dominated, there's still a male presence. So what happened to all those low IQ men that I mentioned earlier? They didn't go to college. That's what happened. Women are consistently attending college more than men. But the thing we're told to complain about is only when men are more likely to be able to do cognitively challenging tasks pertaining to science and technology, despite its clear explanation through our own biodiversity.
I'm going to speak here as a female mechanical engineer. That when I was in school, which was 20 years ago now, the ratio of women to men was probably 1 to 6 when I started, and twice as bad by the time I graduated. And it has been surprising to me that I haven't seen a ton of change in those numbers over the past 20 years. I would have expected that more females would have gone into STEM than have. But I don't know that looking at IQ or things that people tend to study in college and the fact that there are trends between the two binaries has anything to do with people who live outside of those binaries. I don't see what the point is here. Unless the point is to say that you're disdainful of anyone that has an IQ lower than you, which seems to be what he's saying.
Basically, what it breaks down to is that if you're going to argue that men and women are the same, if you're going to argue that men only act like men because they're taught to do so, then why is it so highly correlated?
I hope I'm not repeating myself to drive this point home. But people who believe that there are some people who don't identify with their birth gender are not saying that men and women are the same. What we are saying is that there are men and there are women, and there are sometimes people who live in between the two.
Let's say that 99% of the population identifies as the gender that they were born as. Their argument is that the only reason that that is the case is because we're conditioned into that self-identification. They say that by dressing boys in blue and giving girls dolls instead of trucks, we're perpetuating this oppressive cycle, and that we're abusing our children because we're deciding their gender for them.
I went to an all-girls school when I was young. And something that we noticed about girls that went to all-girls schools is that they tended to do better in science and math when they went to an all-girls school than they did when they went to mixed co-ed schools. Now, I don't want to go into all the psychological reasons behind that, but I think there are differences between boys and girls, and one of those differences is that girls are really self-conscious about what other people think about them in general, more so than boys are. And so when you are self-conscious about what somebody else thinks about you, when somebody starts to criticize you and say, oh, you're not good at math, even them just saying you're not good at math has a higher tendency to make a girl give up and not even try. So what we want to try and do is encourage girls to do things like science and math, and encourage them to realize that when you talk about things like engineering, or when you talk about the movie industry that I used to work in, that there are all kinds of jobs that you can work in within these industries that are very exciting. And I think when you're a young person, you often don't even know what the world looks like. You don't even know what opportunities are out there. You have no idea what you want to do with yourself. And so it's more about, instead of trying to force people into one side or the other, or to raise them one way or the other, it's really just, let's give people the best environment for them to learn and expose them to as much as we can.
They claim that it's only because boys get signed up for T-ball and they're given Legos for Christmas that all of this just so happens to fall into place, which completely ignores the biological differences between male and female brains regarding the different sizes and developments of certain areas of the brain, or the functionality of the neurons in general being different. That was all from one chapter of one book that I have about sexual biodiversity, by the way, and all of those are backed by dozens of clinical trials. Challenge any one of them, and I've got a dozen more examples.
I think the issue with this guy, he's probably a physicist or somebody that thinks like a physicist. And I remember when I was studying engineering in the very beginning, one of the reasons I did it was because I love physics. And the thing about physics is it's like, once you figure out the equation behind something, you are able to then extrapolate out the universe. You know, once you know Newton's law of gravity, everything will always follow that law. It's clean, it's neat, it's beautiful. Real life doesn't work that way. And even when it comes to engineering, as an example, there are so many things that we just don't understand yet. And there's a lot of diversity when it comes to ideas that we think that we already knew perfectly before. So let's just take as an example an airplane wing. Today, we don't know why an airplane wing should be shaped the way that it is. We actually just built 1,000 different airplane wings and put them in wind tunnels, and we tested out every single one until we figured out which one was the best. We still don't know the equation behind why that airplane wing should be shaped the way that it is. So what makes you think that we understand the equation behind human behavior? We don't. And the idea that we should know that already is pretty egotistical.
Do you actually think that parents are consciously forcing their kids into these behaviors? Have you ever been around a parent trying to force his or her kid to do anything?
Okay, yes, sometimes parents do. He is somebody that already conforms with his gender, has probably never actually experienced this. But if you were a kid that did something outside your normal gender expression, I guarantee you your parents said, why are you doing that? If you're a boy that put on a dress, sometimes your parents will be like, why are you putting on that dress? That's not for boys. He should be interviewing some people that don't fit within the normal gender spectrum and asking those people about their experiences instead of just relying on his own experience and then extrapolating out the entire universe from that.
Anything they don't want to do? Do you really think that they'd keep at it for 18 years just to make sure the kid turns out like a boy or a girl? No!
Have you ever heard of parents that actually beat their children because they don't behave the way that they want to? parents that kick their gay children out of the house and disown them. Yeah, it happens. It happens. It's horrifying, but it happens. And I think that if he's just sort of discounting these experiences because he hasn't had them, wow, like that's wow.
No, because they don't need to. Because actually there do exist a subculture of vile, abusive parents that are hell-bent on making their kids transgender for the sake of virtue signaling. Let me get that out of the way.
People that are hell-bent on making their kids transgender. Okay, what about the people that are hell-bent on making their kids fit within the gender that they were born with? Oh my god, I can't.
We had to watch a documentary in one of my AP psychology classes in high school, and this mom gets on the screen and she goes, and then I asked, how long have you felt like a girl? And her son goes, Mama, I don't feel like a girl. I am a girl. And the mom goes, whoa, like it's some sort of magical moment. And the kid's on hormones now and he's being raised like a girl. So yeah.
I just want to correct something for those of you who might not know this. Children are not given access to hormones to transition. The maximum that children will be given exposure to, and actually I should say that I'm taking this from a position as a Canadian, so I'm sure it might be different in different areas. I've looked into this extensively in terms of the UK because I follow a trans man from the UK that's amazing, Jamie Dodger. You should follow him. The rules in the UK and Canada are quite similar, and I'm guessing that they're pretty similar in the US as well. But children are not given testosterone or estrogen to transition. They're given puberty blockers if they need them. And before even having access to puberty blockers, they have to meet with psychologists and go through rigorous testing in that area. And then puberty blockers are something that are reversible. So you are never going through a non-reversible transition while you're still a child. And if you have gone through that, I think that's probably out of the ordinary. And I would be curious as to how that happened. But generally speaking, you're only given puberty blockers until you're an adult. You're also asked to live as your chosen gender for a while before you're given any non-reversible treatments. And so if you live as your gender that you really think you are on the inside for a while, usually for several years, and then you go on hormones, then you would have access to certain surgeries. There's a whole progression that happens, and you have a psychologist that should be working closely with you through this period. It's a misnomer and it's a dangerous concept to start saying that children are allowed to medically transition, because that's not the case. Children are and should be allowed to socially transition, however. So if your child just wants to wear the clothing and makeup and hair or whatever of the opposite gender, there's really no harm in that. It's something that's reversible. They can decide that they don't want to do that anymore. And then when it comes to people that have actually gone through transition, I will not say that there are no examples of people that regret their transition, because there are. And there are some people who have made YouTube videos about their own experience. And often the ones who are expressing regret is a very small percentage of people that have gone through this whole process. And so generally speaking, if you have a psychologist working with you closely and you do wait until you're an adult, the regret percentage is very low. But it does sometimes happen. And usually I think the times that it does happen is with gender non-conforming people, people that are non-binary, because you know that you don't feel quite 100% good in your own skin, but you're led to believe that the only choice is to go all the way on the other side and say that you're the other gender. What if instead we said, it really doesn't matter, that you can behave however you want. You don't need to actually medically transition your body. You can just say, I'm non-binary. I'm gender fluid. I live somewhere in the middle. And then as you get older, you can make your own choices about what you may or may not want to do to your body. I think actually one of the major sources of unhappiness in transition currently today is that people are still reinforcing this binary. And that is what's harmful.
My sister thought she was a boy one time. She cut her hair. She only wore boys' clothes, and she was like 9. This went on for a year, and then she was like, okay, that was fun. I'm all done. Can you imagine what would have happened if my mom was like, yeah, you are a boy, started giving her hormones?
Once again, we would not give hormones to a 9-year-old child. But also, as I mentioned earlier, it's perfectly normal that as children, people will experiment with different genders. So let's just give them the room to do that experimentation without doing anything harmful.
These people are so sick. They literally want to find out if their kid is trans as soon as possible so they can immediately start hormone therapy because they want to block the child from going through puberty. 75 to 95% of these kids won't end up identifying as trans. You are abusing your child for the sake of being on the right side of history. You are dangerously incompetent, and your ancestors are frowning on you. They did not survive plagues and wars just for their bloodline to start throwing hormones around to make their kids confused and depressed for the sake of, it's 2018 America, or 2019 now.
The whole idea behind giving children the freedom to explore is actually to avoid your kids being depressed. Because often what we see is that people that live somewhere in between have much higher suicide rates. People that are trans have extremely high suicide rates, especially as young people, because they're led to believe that they are wrong, that their existence is wrong. And so they think the only way out is suicide. Now, if instead we say, okay, we are giving our children a little bit of freedom to explore, you don't have to decide that right away. And you don't have to decide that when you're 9 years old. You really don't.
No, gender and sex are not different. They are the same thing. There are male brains, there are female brains, there are men, there are women. Transgender people are suffering from gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, whichever DSM you prefer, and we have to help them with their condition. But normalizing this and pretending that it's backed by science helps no one at all. It isn't backed by science, it's backed by child abuse that was labeled as an experiment and some postmodern neo-Marxist theory. That's it.
Well, I hope you learned from this that it's not helpful to take one experiment that was done a long time ago and then extrapolate out from that an entire gender theory. That's not useful at all. I would say the best thing that we can do right now and going forward in the future is to listen to people that have experiences that are somewhere in between the genders and try to accumulate more data as we go along as well. Because for a long time we have not done statistical studies on this stuff, and even if we did, as I said, it was a societal stigma to come forward and say that you felt some way different. So I think we should continue to study this scientifically, but let's not just take one study or one person's experience and then try to extrapolate out the entire human experience from that, because I think that's just wrong. And more importantly than anything else, if someone comes to you and says, hey, I feel like I want to explore this side of myself, and I'm really not quite sure how I think about my gender right now, I think the best thing that you can do is say, I'm here for you, and I accept you as a human being. I will love you no matter what, and let's go through this together. Let's explore it together, and at the end of the day, whatever feels right to you, whichever way you choose to live your life, I will continue to love you. That's the most important thing, because a lot of people, I think, that live somewhere in between really think that people will not love them if they behave the way that they want to. So I hope that watching this was somehow useful to us, at least to learn some of the arguments that are used by the other side and how we can refute some of those arguments. Hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content like this, then go ahead and subscribe. I do have a Patreon account. If you want to support me in being able to continue to create content like this, you can check me out on Patreon. I'll see you next time. Okay, everyone, so today we have Tiny Cat visiting us. What do you think, Tiny? How's life? You a happy cat? You a happy cat? Hello, Tiny. Hello, Tiny. Tiny Cat is always here.